All right. Welcome, everybody, to Run, Walk, Talk Tales of Inclusion and Development. I'm Steph, and my pronouns are she and her, and I'm here with Judy, and her pronouns are she and her. And today we are going to be discussing the book Let Them by Mel Robbins. Let's see your book, Judy.
I've got it here
Oh,
too.
good. All right. It really is a book that seems to be everywhere now. I read mine back in January or so. Are we ready to dive in?
Let's do it. I
Okay,
love it. And I'm thinking, Steph, maybe before we dive into our take on it, do you want to just start off? Should we summarize a little bit about the book for people?
absolutely, absolutely.
Okay.
So the
Okay.
premise of Let Them is really essentially recognizing that you can't control others. So in terms of what they think and what they do, and so you're really saying let them and really relinquishing your need to control what others think about you because you can't control that. Also, the let them theory was really attributed to her daughter in the book when the author sort of was trying to micromanage her son's graduation. And then this really becomes sort of the author's kind of aha moment.
That she can't control everybody.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think the other piece of it is the let me.
That's right.
And so the let me goes to the next step, really, which is the follow up to the let them. So once you recognize you cannot, people, you can't control them essentially, then you have to start looking at what is within my control and what can I do. And it might be that you need to let yourself feel your emotions and then think about what actions you might want to take and then potentially take action. And I think the example from the book that resonated with me on both of this is when she's on the flight.
Mm-hmm.
Do you remember she's on the
Mm-hmm.
plane and there's a person behind her who is
That's
coughing
right.
and not covering their mouth? And she's on
Mm-hmm.
her way to a speaking engagement and she's like, oh my goodness, am I going to get sick? And so if I remember correctly, she kind of gives the person a little bit of a stink eye, but they don't pick up on it. And so then she
Mm-hmm.
turns around and says, would you mind covering your mouth? And they acknowledge her request and then they don't do it. And so, she decides on that flight, like, I don't want to engage any further with this person. I've got to let them be. And so the let me for her, I think she puts on a mask to
Right.
try and protect herself. She
Yeah.
puts on headphones. And I think for that low stakes situation, it works well.
Yeah.
And I think that leads nicely, stuff like when you read the book and you're thinking about it in terms of boundaries, like did it help you in your own approach to setting boundaries? Did it resonate with you?
Well, yeah, I remember that example and
Yeah.
okay, I'll just say I thought when
Yeah.
you're in an airplane, does covering your mouth really help when you're breathing in the same air? I'm just gonna say it,
Maybe not.
you know.
Yeah.
But
Although I do think that man could have covered his
sure,
mouth. Like
sure, sure. Yeah, I totally agree. I totally agree. And I mean, she took care of herself, which sort of makes sense. And
Yes.
I like
Yes.
sort of how you said. I mean, this is a very simple example of
Hmm.
boundaries. And throughout the book around this boundaries piece and whatnot, I was thinking, you know what, real life isn't this simple, right? But I do think if I'm, going to go back to the question around setting boundaries, I really think for me at work, it's the being able to sort of speak up. You have too much work, the ask, talking to your manager, can you extend things? I think it means being able to have those conversations with
Hmm.
employees if something isn't right or somebody says something inappropriate. Yeah, I had a hard time with the sort of the idea of putting on the mask was sort of this, part of this big sort of like let them theory. But I guess in a simple way it could, How about you?
Well, I think I understand what you're saying. I mean, there's things in the book definitely that resonated with me,
Yeah,
but then I read it later than you, so
yeah,
I read it within the last month, and I think that, for me in thinking about it, um, it's probably because some of the information shared was information that I've heard before.
mm-hmm,
And it
mm-hmm.
really reminded me of, that saying, you can't control other people, but you can control yourself. And so I'm
That's
kind of like,
right.
okay, I think that's why it's resonating for me. It's resharing concepts I think we've heard before.
Yeah.
And the other thing that it reminded me of is some time ago, a friend gave me The Places That Scare You by I want to pronounce it correctly, Pema Chodron.
Mm.
And she's a Buddhist monk, and
Mm-hmm.
she writes about the Buddhist concept of non-attachment.
Mm.
And the basic premise, in a very simple way, is don't get attached to material goods, to
Mm-hmm.
ideas or
Mm-hmm.
people. Nothing's
Mm-hmm.
permanent. Things are
Mm-hmm.
always coming and going. And it
Mm.
sort of seemed to me that the Let Them piece is drawing on that.
Interesting. Yeah.
But beyond that, like I think that it's that sort of philosophy of what's within our locus of control. That's not a new idea. So I think that's why it some of the ideas she shared resonated with me. And I think the way that the concept is framed, it's memorable. Let them, let me. The book is very accessible. It's a very easy read.
Yes.
And I could really relate. There's that example she gives in the book where she's starting off her speaking business. She
Right.
wants to be out there
Yeah.
speaking, and she knows that she's got to have a social media presence, and she's a little bit nervous about putting herself out there because how are people going to respond to her social media posts? And she realizes she can't control how people respond. She has to be herself. So I think it's a message we've heard before, really delivered in an accessible way. And so, yeah. Do you agree with this idea that she shares that it's important to let people be who they are for our own sake, for our own peace? What was your take on that?
Yeah. Yeah, I did. Yeah, I do. And
Mm-hmm.
I totally sort of relate to that sort of not new concepts. And I have to, as I was prepping for our podcast today, I went and did some, as you talk about the Buddhist monk, I have a Greek philosopher because again, I exactly sort of thought this is the what's in my control and what isn't in my control kind
Mm-hmm.
of, but set a little bit longer. And it really is a Greek philosopher, Epictetus, sorry if I can say it right, back in like 100 AD who talked about this. So this really isn't a new concept, yet packaged in a very sort of catchy way, right? That
Mm-hmm.
people are
Yeah.
putting it on, they're getting tattoos, you know. So yeah, I do think that there is that little bit of that reminder of that piece.
Yeah.
What again, and I know I've just said this a few minutes earlier, but I like life isn't simple and humans aren't simple. Yeah.
I think we're in
Yeah.
agreement. It's kind of the low stakes. It's easy to apply this, let them, let
Yeah.
me. It's
Yeah.
not as easy to get to as we think it will be. And it's interesting you bring up the tattoos because a lot of people are getting the let them tattooed.
Yeah.
But I'm like, but what about the let me part? Because that's also really important.
That's
And
right.
I was actually, it's funny, I kind of thought, and I'm sure it was a marketing, like, why wasn't the book called Let Them Let Me? Because
Yeah.
that let me piece is a critical piece of it. They go together,
Yeah.
right? So anyhow,
Yes.
um, yeah, I agree. I agree. Uh, and I think we both sort of feel that this is information that we've heard before.
Mm-hmm.
I think if it's a high stakes situation, as you said, it could be a little bit tougher to apply this theory.
Mm-hmm.
She does talk about a situation where there's a husband and he's not doing the things that he needs to kind of have health. Like he's just kind of sitting on the couch eating potato chips, and his wife wants him to get healthier, and so she gives him a gym membership, and he's aggravated by that. And I think we've all heard similar stories to that before.
That's
Like it
right.
doesn't work out well when we try and make people do things that we want them to do. So I think from that perspective, it does bring peace if you can kind of
That's right.
realize that we cannot control and force people to do things that they don't want to do. And if I'm thinking about it in the workplace, yeah, it's great. Like you said, like thinking about what is in my area of control, what is mine to own. Sometimes we'll look around, I'm sure both of us, at the workplace, or we'll hear stories about workplaces where, outside of our teams, there's things happening and we think, oh gosh, if they just did X, Y, and Z, they could solve the problem. And I remind myself daily, for me, it's what is mine to own. Like that's sort of what
That's
I'm
right.
thinking about.
Yeah.
Um, so I think the other piece of this for me, Steph, is thinking about you. And I know there's been some criticism of this
Mm-hmm.
book from an
Mm-hmm.
EDI perspective. Maybe
Yeah,
it's oversimplifying certain things,
that's right.
and really does it gloss over power dynamics and systemic barriers. And so I love
Yeah.
your perspective on that.
Yeah, and this is exactly it where we talk about sort of those maybe lower stakes, not as much, but like when we're thinking about and talking about systemic racism, people who experience racial discrimination in the workplace, this idea of simply sort of letting them and then, kind of let it be just doesn't it it's not acceptable, right? I feel like any of the isms, and of course, this is why in workplaces we have roles like mine and policies and practices.
Hmm.
So that for sure is kind of one of these sort of criticisms. A couple others too that I was, doing some research in one talking about this sort of again, this like promotes passivity, that it's like again with this sort of let them, that we're not encouraging sort of a dialogue, sort of standing up for ourselves. And maybe that's a little
Hmm.
bit in the let them or a let me, sorry, piece, but not like I feel like the let me didn't really get into, I would say, sort of the idea of being an ally, speaking up, like having a hard conversation. Like I would say it
Hmm.
really, it didn't get into a lot of those kind of topics that I can remember anyways. Um, and the last thing, then this is really fascinating, and I feel like this is where potentially we see sort of, again, the idea of this hustle culture, and
Hmm.
the idea that it's sort of in a gentler sort of disguise, shall we say, where, I mean, and maybe this is also not so much in the book as well as sort of Mel Robbins in general has been talking a lot about self-improvement, right? So
Hmm.
when we read self-improvement content, in order for us to have self improvement, it must mean that there's a problem, right? Like we have a problem,
Hmm.
that there's
Hmm.
problems that
Hmm.
we are like, that we're not doing or that, and it needs to be fixed. And that I feel like it's like, I don't need to be fixed,
Hmm.
you know?
Hmm. Hmm.
So, and also too, the last little point too, when I've also been looking at it is around it really is her perspective. There's not as much
Yeah.
I would say like it could almost be maybe not a memoir, but like do you know what I mean? That it's really it's not a ton of like evidence based. It's her
Hmm.
stories and experiences throughout, maybe
Hmm.
sprinkled with a little bit of evidence.
Yes. Yeah. 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 I agree with you. I agree with you. And I think it's interesting what you said about that notion of not needing to be fixed. So, and I mean, there's growth and improving and wanting to get better at things, but then there's also
Yeah.
that feeling of needing to fix oneself, and that's different than and I like that you're raising like that sort of culture of and these self-help books where we're constantly feeling like we
Hmm.
need to fix there's something wrong with us. Um,
Yeah, how have you been sort of like what are your sort of thoughts like or have you been applying this?
well, I think it goes back to what we were talking about earlier, that I think there's things that I've been applying, but I don't know if it's necessarily because of this book. I think it's just sort of that, again, that idea, what is within your own control, what is mine to own.
Yeah.
So I think there's a little bit of that. The one thing though, I will say that I did find interesting in the book, and I've been thinking about it, and it is her notion of, do you remember when she says there's a formula for everything?
Oh, I don't remember
And
this.
oh
Yeah.
yeah,
Please
so
tell me,
she
remind me.
when yeah, when she was going out to do the speaking engagements, you'll probably remember it based on this description. She's going out to do the speaking engagements,
Hmm.
and she realizes like everybody who does these speaking engagements, because she wants to figure out like how do I start promoting
Mm.
myself and
Mm-hmm.
getting on that circuit. So she speaks to people who are already successful
Mm-hmm.
speakers
Oh.
and realizes, oh, there's a formula. So I need to get on social media, and I need to do X
Mm.
amount of posts every week, and I
Mm-hmm.
need to
Mm-hmm.
reach out to this group of people, and that, like, she says it's easy to use that formula. You don't have to create something from scratch.
Right.
if there's an area that you would like to be involved in, whether it's, speaking, getting into a new career, going
That's
back to
right.
school, whatever.
Right.
She's like, and I'm like, yeah, that's true. And that's probably, again, a good reminder for people, like, um, follow a formula, figure out how other people were successful in a particular field.
Be consistent, right? That consistency
Yeah.
piece. And also, like, let's also call it, she probably has a team around her on this. So it's not she's just, you know,
No,
there's a team
absolutely.
supporting her, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
yeah.
All right. Well, Steph, I think it was an interesting conversation to have around
Yeah.
this book that we're seeing everywhere. And so until next time.
Thanks.